Okay, so you're here to, really get into it, right? To go deep on a topic without, getting lost in all the details.
That's right, to get to those aha moments.
Exactly. And I think, today we've got a really great one for that because we're going to be diving into the world of the artist Bob Camblin.
Yes.
And what's so fascinating is we've got a whole bunch of different sources here. We've got some excerpts from his own writings, which are quite interesting.
Very interesting.
We have his biography
Uh-huh.
and some information on his books like Zen and the Art of Enlightenment and Bob Camblin and Complete Works Volume 1.
Right.
Even a YouTube transcript discussing one of his pieces
Yep.
and just some general historical information and,
Right.
reviews and quotes about him.
Sounds like a lot to work with.
It is a lot. And I think
Doesn't.
our mission today is to sort of cut through the mystery and try to get to the heart of what made Camblin so unique.
Well, I think one of the things that makes him so compelling is that he remains this very widely recognized yet enigmatic figure.
Right.
His work is very highly regarded, it's fiercely collected, but he himself was rather elusive. So I think that adds to the allure for sure.
Elusive is a great word
Yeah.
because if you look at his life, he was born in Oklahoma in 1928,
Okay.
studied at the Kansas City Art Institute, gets a Fulbright scholarship to Italy.
Oh, wow.
He teaches at, big name universities like Rice University. He's exhibiting, he's collaborating. But then in 1976, he just drops out of all that and embraces this nomadic life, living solely from the sales of his artwork.
That's interesting. So it's not just an artist who's talented, it's someone who made very specific choices for their life.
Absolutely, and I think that's why he's so interesting. So let's get into like some of the core ideas. When you look at his art, when you look at his writings, what really stands out to you?
Well, I think one of the things that I noticed right away was this engagement with the concept of balance.
Okay.
This idea of this sort of push and pull between opposite ideas.
Got
And I think a good example of this is a quote from him where he says, "Balancing and being for and against, we missed the clouds, and for a moment regretted it. Then as lightning, the mind ripped out in flashes of variations to reach the still pond."
Wow.
And so for me, this is not just poetic language. It's really suggestive of a process, this process of holding these contradictory viewpoints, the for and against,
Right.
feeling that tension, and then the sudden moment of clarity, like a lightning bolt, that kind of illuminates the still pond.
Interesting. And there's this other quote where he says, "I will stick with common sense and try for the perfectly average view of the universe. I think that will let me enjoy miracles on both sides of science and magic and the nuances of the smear between the whiteness and the blackness and hope that I can be around when the two meet in the near future and we have an intensely bright gray." It's so interesting to me because it's like he's not trying to pick a side. He's saying, I want to experience this ambiguity, this bright gray that he's talking about. It's where these seemingly incompatible concepts can coexist, like science and magic.
Yeah, and for me, that suggests a desire to move beyond just this kind of simplistic either thinking
Right.
and embrace this complexity of the world that we live in.
Absolutely.
And there's another quote where he says, "Resist and submit, held in perfect balance, figure 4."
Ooh, that's good.
So it's really this idea that it's not about choosing one over the other. It's about holding both of those forces in this dynamic state of tension and balance.
It reminds me of like a carefully constructed trap
Exactly.
where that tension itself becomes the
He's
point.
a point, exactly.
Yeah. And then if we've sort of transitioned this into his view of art itself, he asks, what is art but a series of questions disguised as images? What is philosophy but an attempt to answer those questions, knowing full well the answers will always be incomplete? And to me, that reframes his art, not as a provider of answers, but as a constant sort of catalyst for questioning and exploration.
And it's interesting because he sees that purpose of art evolving. In another quote, he says, "Art is not just images. Art for art's sake has become art for life's sake, or art for my sake, or art for survival's sake."
Right.
So this is a shift for him away from a purely aesthetic appreciation of art
Okay.
towards something much more personally essential for him and perhaps for us in this very complex world that we live in.
Yeah. And then there's this great excerpt from a book review that you pulled where it basically says that rather than presenting straightforward narratives or prescriptive meanings, the images and symbols prompt viewers to engage in an active, contemplative process akin to a spiritual practice.
Right.
So to me, that means that looking at a Camblin piece isn't isn't just visual appreciation.
Yeah.
It's an invitation to introspective thought.
Absolutely. I think that the viewer plays a very active role in experiencing his art.
Oh, for sure.
And speaking of that, one piece that really stands out is his artwork, Whatnot. Oh, yeah.
It's just this jar on a shelf.
A jar on a shelf.
Oh.
But you look closer, you see the instructions. Pick up the jar, swirl until cloudy, shake until thoroughly mixed.
Just very unexpected.
So unexpected. Suddenly, the static artwork demands that you interact with it, even if it's just in your mind.
Right.
And then when you look at this in the context of the excerpt that we have from Zen and the Art of Enlightenment, it connects directly to this idea of mindfulness in everyday actions.
Yeah. I mean, just swirling this jar suddenly becomes a potential moment of being present.
Totally.
And if we then kind of bring in this YouTube discussion on Whatnot,
Right.
one of the themes that's really interesting to me is this idea of letting things settle.
Right.
Like, because you swirl the jar and it creates this temporary obscuring, this cloudiness. And that kind of mirrors how the busyness of our lives can often obscure our own clarity. Exactly. And the video really highlights this idea that sometimes the most profound insights come not from like forcing an answer, but from just being patient and allowing those answers to reveal themselves.
It's this visual metaphor for, the power of patience in life.
Right. Because the jar becomes a symbol for your own mind,
Yeah.
To let the water settle, to let the thought settle so that clarity can emerge. And it's interesting because even that YouTube transcript talks about making peace with ambiguity.
Yeah.
Like that we don't have to control and fix everything.
So sometimes trying to do that actually leads to more confusion.
Exactly. And this acceptance of uncertainty, I think, is a recurring theme for Camblin. He even wrote, "Fortunately, some things remain forever." Or another 10 years, perhaps, There's a little hint of like the temporary nature of things.
Right. And then in the book review of Zen and the Art of Enlightenment, it says, the art invites you to embrace impermanence as a liberating force, a reminder that all things change, including your own minds.
Yeah. And it's interesting that he sort of saw it as liberating, not as something to be afraid of.
Right. Just accepting that everything is in flux.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we've talked about balance. We've talked about this kind of, mindfulness. But there's also this more playful, almost deceptive side to his work.
For sure.
I mean, this quote, "Fool the eye, fool the mind," that definitely points to, his interest in ambiguity, illusion, playing with our perception.
Yeah, and the book review also talks about his drawings where there are these paradoxes made visible.
Right.
And these tricks of illusion and these, traps that don't trap, structures that are made to appear stable but are inherently deceptive.
Right. Like he's really messing with you.
Exactly.
And what's really interesting to me is that his biography talks about these data problems that he would incorporate into his drawings.
Yeah, those are fascinating.
They're not just random artistic flourishes. They're like deliberate codes and traps.
Yeah.
Like he wants you, the viewer, to actively engage with the work and try to decipher what the deeper meaning is.
Yeah, he's embedding these puzzles in the art. He's demanding that the viewer participate.
It's like a very active role that he wants you to play.
Yes, definitely.
So to kind of understand the root of these ideas, let's look at the biography a little bit in terms of his influences. So we know he was born in Oklahoma, went to art school, went to Italy, taught, and then, shifted into this nomadic existence. But what were some of the key influences that sort of informed his vision?
Well, several things stand out. The biography mentions Ralph Waldo Emerson,
Okay.
the I Ching, haiku, and haiga.
Interesting.
So I think this points to an early interest in, transcendentalist ideas, Eastern philosophy, these very concise and evocative forms of expression, where it's more about suggestion than explicit statement.
Right. And that makes sense. He spent time in Italy, was exposed to the Italian Renaissance masters at the Uffizi Gallery.
Right.
So that probably informed his sense of form and composition. But then there's this other interesting influence, which is the catacombs of Palermo, which, these abstract figurative forms apparently left a lasting impression on him, and you see it reflected in his work.
It's fascinating how all these different things play into his art.
Yeah, and even something like The Wizard of Oz is mentioned as an influence.
Wow.
And Gunnar Grass's dog ears directly inspired his scarecrow imagery.
Huh.
Which is interesting because the scarecrows appear a lot in his work.
They do. And, the biography also talks about his collaborative spirit.
Oh, yeah.
So, for example, there was this B&E Productions with Earl Staley and Joe Tate, and they were even signing works as anonymous.
Interesting.
So it's like this de-emphasis on the individual ego.
Right.
and maybe more of a focus on the collective artistic idea.
It almost makes me think of like a band.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Like a musical group.
yeah. And then there's this style that he developed with Nancy Giordano called Muchas Volantes, using dots and dashes to create optical illusions.
Yeah.
So then this playing with perception.
Right. And it's also interesting to look at the evolution of his themes over time. His early work was very engaged with social protest,
Okay.
but then he began to blend this social realism with non-objective abstraction. And then in the 1970s, he really shifted toward themes of metamorphosis and the cyclical nature of life.
And you see those recurring symbols, the puppets, the scarecrows, the skulls, the murky water.
Yeah. And for me, those images really speak to this deep engagement with, these fundamental questions of transformation and the human condition.
It's like he's wrestling with these big ideas through his art.
Absolutely.
So I guess the question becomes, why? Why this particular approach?
Yeah.
Why was this so important to him?
Well, according to his biography, he was really interested in evoking subjective states of mind in the viewer.
Okay.
He wanted to challenge our understanding of reality in ways that he felt went beyond even the conventions of surrealism.
That's interesting.
And he believed that words often, fall short of really capturing the direct experience of art.
That makes sense.
And I think this might explain why any text that he does incorporate into his paintings, it often functions more as visual shapes.
Right.
Like clues or potential entry points, rather than like straightforward explanations.
And it sounds like his main goal was to get the viewer involved in the work,
Yeah.
to encourage their own exploration, and through that process, to facilitate some kind of personal discovery.
And I think that's what makes his art so powerful.
Absolutely. And he also was very adamant that he didn't think of art as being, heavy.
Right.
He said, I don't consider art heavy. I use humor and seriousness interchangeably. It's like he didn't want people to take it all so seriously.
Yeah. For him, it was about creating this encounter, a space for personal reflection and interpretation.
Exactly. So as we kind of wrap things up here, what's clear is that Bob Camblin was an artist who was deeply engaged with these fundamental questions about, how we perceive reality, how do we navigate these opposing forces in the world, and how do we make sense of this constantly changing human experience.
Yeah, and I think he also encourages us to look at art in a different way.
Right. To actually think about it.
To think about it, to engage with it, and not just passively observe.
Yeah. And hopefully throughout this deep dive, you've had a few of your own aha moments as we've explored his blend of philosophical inquiry, artistic experimentation, and this very grounded engagement with the everyday.
I think that image of the swirling jar from Whatnot is a great reminder for all of us. This idea of patience, letting clarity emerge organically and not trying to force understanding.
I love that.
Yeah.
So it's a final thought for you. In a world that's constantly bombarding you with information and demanding that you have all the answers, what new perspectives can you gain by actually embracing ambiguity? By asking more questions and letting the water in your own mind settle?
I like that.
And maybe, if you have the opportunity, seek out some of Bob Camblin's work. Encounter his art firsthand.
Maybe find your own mystic switch.
Exactly. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.